Gobies, this is their food. Unlike most of the native species in Lake Ontario that really can't make hay off of dry seeded mussels, these guys do just fine, and we're able to quickly proliferate and become the dominant portion of the benthic biomass in the lake. Part of it is a pretty distressing story. Round gobies came in, colonized the spawning reefs. John Fitzsimons was still out there swimming around in the fall on a reef in western Lake Ontario and measuring egg deposition and the numbers of emerging fry being produced to that. And these are fry here, this is round goby here. And before round goby, fry production was really quite good. In fact, it was lake superior good on this reef, so it looked like we were at the precipice of natural restoration or natural reproduction in the lake. Enter round goby, and very quickly they shut off egg deposition and fry out at that reef. Basically, fry production goes to zero. Goby abundance goes up to about 150 per square meter. When you compare this to sculpin abundance on that reef, the other primary egg predators, they were about 17 per square meter. So it looks like sheer numbers of gobies in the lake were supporting this impact. But it's not all a bad news story. Predators quickly found gobies and began to eat them. Their abundance peaked and has come down somewhat, and lake trout started incorporating them into their diet. In fact, a large portion, especially young lake trout diet, approaching 40%, you think now is gobies. So this is the threshold of early mortality syndrome that we need to get above in the eggs. So thiamine levels that need to be exceeded in the eggs for survival and recruitment. This star right here represents Fitzsimons' monitoring of that through the prior decade, from 1994 to 2004. And all the values he saw were half or below that threshold. So most of the lake trout weren't producing viable fry in that prior decade. Enter gobies, and importantly, enter Jacques Richard down at SUNY Brockport University. Jacques starts monitoring thiamine levels in lake trout starting around 2009, and the red dots are the means, and the common theme here is it looks like things look pretty good now for lake trout reproduction in Lake Ontario. We're pretty excited about this. So to step back just one step and look at where we're at with the adult stock, because adult stock really is the fuel for this driver, even though the impediments are at the earliest life stages. Adult stock was quite high early in the program, then declined, and declined again, and has been in the rebuilding phase. The black is the force of sea lamprey predation on the adult stock. This is the history of control here that I talked about before. This is a blip up where 3 streams that had new populations of lamprey in them were missed. And those 3 streams appear to have caused a doubling in the population in Lake Ontario when the stock was already at a depressed state. The response appears to be a collapse in the stock. So I want you to focus a bit on here. About 6 years prior, lake trout stocking was cut by 50%, although the folks that wrote the plan were hopeful that adult mortality and the longevity of lake trout would buoy the low levels of adult mortality, would buoy the stock and maintain them near this level for a longer period of time. That wasn't the case. Right after the stocking cuts, the adult stock responded in kind. 50% reduction of the fuel going in turns the engine 50% slower. And then enter the sea lamprey blip up here, and further reduction in the adult stock. And the other thing that was going on here, lamprey are size selective, almost push this a little faster. Lamprey are size selective, so they removed the adults. So they delayed what we thought we were going to see in the reproduction. But then the adult stock built in this time period. And the other thing that's interesting to see, this is the second experiment with stocking at that level at 500,000 fish. And again, it produces the same number of lake trout. So if you lower the stocking, the adults go down. Now, this is the history of the natural reproduction. We saw that blip up here when adults were abundant. A long period when it was just background, it's still ongoing, but just background in the lake. And these are ages 0s, 1s, and 2s. And then we saw this explosion in the late 2000s. And part of this was round gobies, and part of this was the adult stock building up. But one of the themes that fell out of this is all these fish almost all of them were coming off the west end of the lake at the Niagara Bar. Very few of them were coming off the spawning habitat in the east. So we went back out there and we took another look at the spawning habitat. And Fish and Wildlife went to the Niagara River and wired the river with acoustic receivers and began tagging fish to look at distribution and timing of migrations into the river. We got Ellen to come down again, Ellen Marsden, and bring her ROV. We went back out to where she went in the 80s, and this is what the habitat looked like now. All of it was impacted, all of it was infilled. When we went out the next year and excavated it, it appeared to be Dreissenid shells. We were really worried about this. We were thinking that the whole eastern basin might be affected like this. So we went out last year and started looking at some of those other historical sites. That doesn't appear to be the case, so that's the good news. The cool thing from Dimitri and his group's work down in the Niagara River with the acoustics is the lake trout are going in the river and they're piling up near the spawning habitat at this magical 10 degrees C mark when lake trout spawn in the lake, and then they're leaving quickly afterwards. And when Dimitri and his group went out and looked for eggs and larvae, they in fact found them. So this is adjusting our way of thinking about riverine spawning habitat. The lake too is adding to the supply of limited spawning habitat. So I will say a few things about climate change. We heard a really nice talk about it. Prior to this, it really set up this idea for us. I wanted to look at a review of the impacts for Lake Ontario, and fortuitously there was one that was just done recently. And they're talking about earlier and later turnover, larger, longer and more stable stratification, warmer surface temps, greater precipitation levels, less ice to cover, more and stronger storms, similar to what you heard just prior to this. Where does that interface on the landscape that lake trout occupy in the nearshore zone? There's been a recent study in the Canadian experimental lakes that looked at this, and as the nearshore warmed with climate over 15 years in the study, lake trout decreased their use of that zone, and condition in lake trout went down. We expect that nearshore access to resources will dwindle as well. A little bit worried about how that access to spawning habitat is going to play out. Spawning habitat in Lake Ontario, what we know of so far, is pretty much between 5 and 10 meters of water, and we're looking at a lake that's going to have bigger waves, greater storm intensity and frequency, changes in direction in the fetch of the storms as they encounter these shoals, less protective ice cover on the landscape. And that habitat volatility is really important in the eastern basin where lake trout are spawned, because the depths that the juvenile over summer at, while the thermocline is set up, are just at the bottom of the thermocline, and we already get warm water intrusions. If the thermocline expands and we have greater intensity of storms, this is probably going to get a lot worse. So this is really the argument that I was thinking a lot about. How do we go out into that developing tension between anglers and ecosystem restoration folks and say to those folks, why are lake trout important? There's a lot of things from the history of the lake and lake trout behavior that we can talk about. Diversification and persistence in the fishery. It's a more interesting fishery with more types of fish to fish for. But the fisheries in the other lakes where Chinook salmon have declined, the lake trout fishery is persistent. So this adds this element of persistence to the fishery. We know they thrive in oligotrophic conditions throughout their range, and certainly in the Great Lakes going back to glaciation. We know that they were the dominant hypoliminetic predator biomass prior to their extirpation in the lake, and likely controlled prey fish abundance and had some resistance to some of these invasions. We didn't see proliferation of alewives and smelt until the native lake trout were disappearing. And this was a thought that was widely circulated in the past and appeared in newspaper articles in the early 1990s. If you want to cut lake trout in favor of Chinook salmon, you're also going to cut sea lamprey controlled dollars. You're not going to have a very good Chinook salmon fishery. Talking to the commission today, they're reforming their view on it. So how do they fit now and into the future? And this really is my summary. So these are the two questions that I crystallized around from this exploration in the past. Does the abundance of predators that we produce from trying to restore lake trout in the lake align with both the sport fishery goals and the native Carignan restoration goals? If we have lake trout out there, they're taking away alewife food from Chinook salmon. And as we saw, alewife food is already depressed. and we know that alewives impede restoration. Also, we're placing their native food in the lake right now in places where we're stocking the native food's predator, lake trout, right on top of it. How does that align? We can use those thoughts maybe to recalibrate the future. And what is the right choice for a warmer and stormier Lake Ontario? I mean, really, where this is coming to a head for me right now is those stocking cuts. Stocking cuts not only brought down the adult stock, they're limiting our ability to put available genetic diversity on the landscape into the lake. If we have fewer fish, we can't make as much of an advantage out of that genetic diversity. And with that same idea in the Upper Lakes and the successes in Lake Huron, federal hatcheries are increasingly turning away from lake trout into criggins. That's affecting our ability to get at that genetic diversity. It's disappearing from the hatchery system. This is one of the big issues we're going to have to think about as we go forward. How do we continue that conservation biology approach and maximize the adaptability of this stock in a time when environmental drivers and size and climate change are happening? We need to get lake trout out there that spawn deeper than the current stock. And that's all I have. Thanks.